Thank you, Dr. Kernberg. Because of time, we're going to just want to have enough time for the discussion, so we're going to extend that into the pre-planned lunchtime by about 15 minutes, and we'll just push everything back when we reconvene. So it would be best if you have questions to use the microphones on either side of the auditorium as we get started. There's a microphone right behind there. It's right behind there.
Your help with some of the question have a hearing difficulty, and particularly with microphones.
You can, if you have questions, you can line up at either microphone, and we'll alternate.
Well, I just wanted to comment on. I'm Janet Fennell, NPAP. I want to comment on the role of envy, and I know that's been one of Dr. Kernberg's big topics along with narcissism, but I was just thinking of it outside of narcissism, but as a general resistance for people coming to treatment, thinking of it more in the sense of Rivera and Horney and the anxiety of the beginning patient to turn to someone for help, to be vulnerable, and that sense of self that would be on the masochistic end and would perceive the therapist, the analyst, as the idealized object imbued with sadism. And then I wondered, again, if any of that showed up in Theodor Reik's writing, and I always found quite fascinating Reik's concept of kuvad, which was the man's experiencing the labor pains. He wrote about it, and it's particularly interesting because Reik interpreted it as the male's envy of the female's power of procreation. So that's basically what I wanted to bring up. Thank you.
Shall I? Yeah. I think that indeed we have to broaden the concept of penis envy by Freud as a basic motivational issue in the development of women by the awareness of the mutual envy of the sexes, which is part of normal psychology. I think this is probably generally accepted nowadays, and in that regard, the Reik's concept indeed is kind of pioneer statement that has been developed particularly by Melanie Klein and her school, although of course you find it also in the American culturalists and relationists. I think that there is indeed, as part of the ambivalence toward mother, intense ambivalence both on the part of the little girl and the little boy, idealization and envy of mother are common issues in both genders, and in a narcissistic pathology in which pre-Oedipal issues predominate so strongly with usually intense aggression, hatred, envy of mother, are reflected in men's exaggerated, profound envy of women's sexuality that founds a specific pathology in narcissistic patients, and there we find it clinically. Very brief example: patient of mine, enormous difficulty maintaining himself in any relationship. He idealizes women, and then after weeks or months, dismantles them, devalues them internally, and the relationship ends. He's desperate about it, but can't avoid it. And what happens to this man is that when he has sex with a girlfriend, first of all, if she enjoys sex more than he feels exploited and enraged. In a deeper sense, if his girlfriend tells him how much she loves him, if she's able to combine sexual enjoyment with telling him freely how much she loves him, it evokes an extraordinary hatred that he can't explain, but that, of course, destroys the possibility of the relationship. I'm not exaggerating what I'm summarizing to you here. In the case of women, penis envy is an important dynamic, but it is particularly exaggerated in women with severe pre-Oedipal issues, where the hatred of mother and the envy of mother is then transferred from mother to father. So the most intense penis envy in women is actually not found in women whose problems are predominantly Oedipal but pre-Oedipal. But in any case, your point is very well taken about the importance of mutual envy in contrast to the exclusive focus on penis envy of women.
I would like to just add very quickly a contemporary focus on penis envy, because we no longer really believe that feminine attributes can be traced to penis envy, as Freud first proposed. And as Otto has just indicated, penis envy of an intense nature really does not indicate normal femininity. It is much more associated with masculinity and with unresolved problems in the primary relationship with both parents, particularly the mother. But in a more contemporary perspective, one has to add penis envy in the male. I used to get, and I still do, and I'm sure this is common, on the internet, continuous ads for penis extenders, more power to the penis, penis enlargers, penis ointments, all kinds of things to somehow enhance, empower the penis, enlarge the penis, extend the penis, and so forth. The penis envy of the male is tremendous. And it is not just, I think Freud really projected this because of his problems with his 5 sisters. He projected this on to the women. The men have tremendous penis envy. The little boy envies father. He envies father's size, envies father's competence, envies father's increased capacities, and envies father's larger penis. It's only one aspect of the boy's envy of the father, part of the Oedipus complex, and really also having prephallic roots. But it's of interest to me that penis envy, originally so much ascribed to women, today it's very clearly much of male development and remains a very important concern among men.
Hello, and first of all, I want to thank you. Carl has put together again a fantastic, marvelous panel. I think it's a joy to be here. It's a real joy. And what I'm thinking of is the contributions that Theodor Reik made, and how today you may be, in a sense, the representatives of the core of his thinking, you know, where it moves. And where I'm thinking of is how Blum and Kernberg and all of you brought in a very powerful developmental model. All of, in a sense, Otto Kernberg looking at the pre-Oedipal through the Oedipal and into the barriers of falling and remaining in love, and extending your work today. I hear you all along the way, and I'm wondering how powerfully connected it is to Theodor Reik, and also with how Blum definitely doing something along the similar lines, and Little Hans, you were here last time, did something along these wonderful lines. And of course, the other speaker on the role of the dyad. So I'm wondering how you would maybe see similarity and differences in the way you would interpret the pre-edible, the developmental line, and connect it with your experience of Reich. Are you just, that would be sort of a comparison, maybe, or contrast. Thank you. It was wonderful.
No, it's really, no. I mean, you go ahead. I think that's really a little bit closer to Otto's domain or your domain. I could say a few things, but it wouldn't be so relevant.
Well,
Hi, I'm Maggie Zelner, also from NPAP. And it's been great the whole morning. And I also appreciated Carl's historical context. That was very helpful. So one comment I wanted to make, and then I had a question for anybody on the panel. So the comment is about this issue of the pioneers fading away in the literature. And I don't know how unique that is to psychoanalysis, because the other field that I'm familiar with is neuroscience, and the same thing is the case, that there's very little literature that's ever cited, before 1980. It depends on what the field is. So I think on the one hand, that has to do with sort of a late 20th century, early 21st century phenomenon of just, there's so much knowledge, who do you cite and when? And I also wonder how much it has to do with sort of the accumulation of knowledge as a science or as a practice, that we start to internalize certain concepts and we kind of forget who originated them. You could also say that Freud set the bar, by not giving very much acknowledgement to his predecessors in his own writing. And also, I think there might be a sort of a sociological influence of online database research, because when you do online literature searches, there's very little right now that comes up before the 1980s, at least in the scientific literature. So I'm sort of wondering, on that level, if there's something unique to psychoanalysis, if we're defensively letting those folks fade away, or if it has more to do with these other processes. And then just another question, if anybody wanted to address it, is sort of, I was, as a candidate coming through in the 90s and the last 10 years of, it's always seemed to me that the major schools of psychoanalysis are not actually contradictory, that they ultimately are complementary. But I'm not sure if that's my own sort of postmodern perspective. And so I'm wondering if any of you guys wanted to say anything about how some of Reich's ideas might actually be contradictory to ego psychology or any other dominant school of thought. So that's my question.
I can probably say a few things about that. I mean, I certainly agree with Harold's statement that the pioneers tend to fade away in psychoanalysis, and perhaps with the exception of Freud, many other analysts who were prominent at one time, such as Heinz Hartmann or Otto Kernberg or even Anna Freud are no longer referenced in the same way that they were. But I think there's a difference between that kind of fading away and what happened to Reik, Theodor Reik, or for that matter, Ferenczi. I think for example, Ferenczi, much of what he was writing really sort of went against the grain of the time, in terms of what was really sort of becoming the sort of like dominant tradition. And then there are all sorts of complicated personal and political factors. And so I think Ferenczi faded away very early on, perhaps more rapidly than one would normally fade away. I think there was a kind of, actual ostracism of Ferenczi, and that happened with many other analysts such as Otto Rank and so on. And I think in the case of Reik as well, obviously so many of his ideas were really went against the grain of the kind of writing that was common in the 40s and the 50s. And although he received widespread, sort of public acclaim in North America, I'm not sure how well he was acknowledged within the psychoanalytic mainstream. Some of the reasons were theoretical, and some were, were political as well. I won't get into it. Now, the striking thing you see, I think, is with people like Theodor Reik. When you go back and reread Reik, you can see how so much of what he was saying, although out of tune with the times, is so much in tune with what people are writing about now. And that's true with Sandor Ferenczi as well. Now, that's not the case right now with Heinz Hartmann to the same extent, and it's not the case with, with Otto Finichel. I mean, it may be that there will come a time when people rediscover Heinz Hartmann and Otto Finichel once again, when the ideas that were really sort of central to their thinking, capture people's interest once again. But I think it's important to make those kinds of distinctions. I don't think it's just the kind of normal fading away which tends to happen to any ancestor.
Hi, Mort, is this working? Yes. Oh, Mort Israel, NPAP. Before I make my comment, just a quick story about my grandson and penis envy. He's a little under 3 years old, and his father brought him into the bathroom to show him how a man urinates. And he urinated, and he looked up at his father and said, "Gee, Dad, that's awesome." Awesome seems to permeate our literature, our contemporary world today. Awesome. In regard to masochism in modern man, just a minor correction just to start off my point. It was published in German in 1939 and came out in the U.S. in 1941 rather than 1949. Maybe unconsciously you thought of 1949 because that's the publication of his confession. Fragment of a great confession.
That's the copyright date. Perhaps it's a later edition.
Maybe it's a later edition.
That's the book I received from Carl.
Right. But the one story about that, as many of you know, Reich felt that was his masterpiece, and he wanted Freud to read it, but Freud never was able to read it before he died in 1939. And Freud, he was very upset, but it harks back to that relationship that Reich had with his father, where in 1906, when he was just accepted at the University of Vienna, he wasn't able to tell his father that he had been accepted. And his father had a heart attack. Many of you know this story, but I'm bringing it up to make a point. He ran to the drugstore to get some medication, and what happened was his father had died before he was able to bring the medication home. He would have died anyways, but he was so guilt-ridden. Reich was so guilt-ridden that for a year, as a freshman at the University of Vienna, he read all of the works of Goethe and all the works about Goethe at that time. So that was certainly indicated the extraordinary guilt that Reich had throughout his life that he was contending with, but his extraordinary intellect as well. But the one book that's going to be talked about this afternoon that I think is so related is the issue of the superego. And in the compulsion to confess, Reich says so clearly and so poignantly that it's critical to have a benign superego. That's our mission. With that benign superego, we can accept our strengths, our limitations of ourselves as well as others. And unconscious guilt, the need to punish ourselves, and the compulsion to confess, underneath it all is the issue of a rigid or unhappy or difficult superego, and our mission is to make that superego more flexible and more palatable. I think that permeates all of his work, as well as unconscious guilt, which you mentioned, Dr. Blum. Thank you.
No more?
I think there might be one of these.
Is this a
Well-
compulsion to end on time?
Well,
It's exactly new.
I'm
well,
hungry.
I would just like to say that in addition to having a benign superego, because it's easy to condense the requirements for maturity into one kind of capsule, but as we just heard from Otto Kernberg, there's also a very important capacity to love and to be loved, a capacity to forgive, or I would put it somewhat in an enlarged sense, a capacity for reconciliation after strife and after crisis and after quarrels. So this capacity for reconciliation is a requirement for really maintaining a healthy, loving object relationship. And as far as not being able to coerce love, I think it's well to remember what Freud said in Civilization, Its Discontents. He was railing against Jesus at the time. He felt that the commandment to love thy neighbor was, first of all, impossible, and secondly, he said, suppose your neighbor's a horse thief. But I think the idea basically is love cannot be commanded. As Freud noted, it's a wonderful precept, the idea of loving your neighbor, one of the great civilizing precepts or adages. But at the same time, it's impossible because love cannot be commanded, it cannot be coerced. So the commandments to love, of course, are doomed to failure in that regard. Now, before we end, I wanted to get back to the whole question here of co-construction. I think we shouldn't just leave that without a little bit of further discussion. And I had just given this talk in Frankfurt on the 50th anniversary of their institute. And I dealt with the issue of co-construction because it's particularly concerned now in current psychoanalytic object relations theory, in our much greater awareness of countertransference, and in the whole question of the influence of the dyad on each other, the conscious and unconscious communications and influences that analyst and analysand have on each other. And what I'd like to emphasize from my point of view is that while co-construction to a degree is inevitable, we all select the data, we organize the data, we interpret the data, inevitably with subjectivity, with individual variance, so that there's always a degree of co-construction in the dyad, but only a degree, because the timeless unconscious fantasies have preceded the relationship between analyst and patient. The patient arrives with a personality of his or her own. The patient has a character structure which the analyst has not co-constructed or created. In fact, character is hardest to change of all the aspects we work with and expect to change in psychoanalysis. Listen to the following associations. Patient is on the couch and saying, we have just crowded classrooms, too many children. The teachers aren't able to deal with such crowds of children, and the teachers aren't dedicated enough. They don't really pay enough attention to the individual child. What we need is to deal with the whole problem of excessive crowds in education, better and more dedicated teachers, and beyond that, we have overpopulation. We have to deal more effectively with birth control. The patient had unconsciously noticed his analyst's pregnancy. She had not said a word. Was this co-constructed? Well, yes, in a certain sense, she co-constructed the pregnancy with her husband, not with the patient. The patient reacted to this. She hadn't said a word about it. She had decided to wait for him to acknowledge it, to take notice of it. He first unconsciously noted before he was consciously aware of it. Now, what was revived was something from the past. his sibling rivalry, his anger at his mother and the newborn sibling when he was a little boy. It's based on the revival of the unconscious fantasy in the present. What was co-constructed in that sense was a day residue, something in the analytic situation. Her pregnancy activated the past and brought up the infantile anger at his mother and his sibling rivalry, his sibling envy, etc. So you can see about the overcrowded classroom, where it was right there in the analytic situation. The co-construction has to be taken in context. To some degree, it's like the day residue of the dream. Now, it's true that it can be so important at times that it may derail the analysis. If the analyst's countertransference or failure to notice what's going on and effectively understand and interpret it, it can certainly derail the analysis. It can lead to a stalemate. At times, it may take precedence over everything else. But ordinarily, co-construction has those major limitations. And my concern is that if this is overemphasized, the role of the unconscious conflicts and fantasies, the preceding character of the patient, the importance of what preceded the analysis and brought the patient into analysis in the first place, tends to be minimized or even lost. And the here and now then takes an extraordinary precedence over the childhood past.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of tempted to to respond, but I think in some ways it would be somewhat of a sort of a silly debate to get into. You know, obviously, this idea of co-construction can be taken to an extreme, and you know, perhaps that's the concern that you're raising. You know, but by the same token, I think just pragmatically, it's extremely valuable to always recognize that in the same way that the patient is bringing their own history and fantasies and, you know, sort of unconscious contributions to the relationship, so is the analyst. And what the analyst brings affects both the analyst's perceptions and also it affects the kind of material that the patient produces as well. You know, so the material that the patient is produced, of course, is affected by their history and their unconscious fantasy and so on, but it's also affected by the particular unique way in which they interpret contributions, conscious and unconscious, that the analyst brings. So I think it's really sort of a pragmatic issue rather than sort of a, you know, either or kind of issue.
I'd like to kind of contribute to this discussion with a kind of suggestion for some differentiation of concepts. It seems to me that one has to differentiate certain slogans from a clinical reality. One is two-person psychology, one-person psychology. I think that the reality is we have a three-person psychology since Freud's time, meaning the patient's transference, the analyst's countertransference, and the analyst split between the part of him that is enacting the countertransference and the part of him that is in an ongoing self-observing stance to explore the countertransference in terms of whether the problem comes from the patient or from himself, or to what extent it comes. And ideally, the analyst should intervene from a position of technical neutrality, which doesn't mean disgruntled indifference, as Freud said in his famous letter to Fist, I think, 1916, but a concerned objectivity, so that the analyst's emotional reaction, fantasy, has to be explored by him, but explored in terms of an ongoing effort to differentiate what in his reaction to the patient represents enactment of his own past, what is a reaction to the patient, and helps to better understand the patient. And here the concept of various types of identification in the countertransference come into play, whether it's a concordant or a complementary identification in the countertransference. And one has to differentiate, it seems to me, enactment as the activation of an emotional response of the analyst to the patient, which is a compromise between what the patient is doing and what comes from the analyst, the emotional enactment in the analyst from the analyst's intervention. In other words, one has to differentiate enactment from acting out of the countertransference, and that's where the concept tends to get blurred. If the analyst acts out his countertransference, then we have a co-construction. But if the analyst is able to analyze the countertransference, transform it into interpretation from a technical and neutral viewpoint, we've had enactment but not acting out, and a co-construction is a minimum, although it can never be avoided completely. It seems to me that it's helpful to kind of delimit the concept of enactment and not confuse it with acting out. On the other hand, acting out of the countertransference is, from a technical viewpoint, an inappropriate behavior of the analyst, intruding with his own issues, and it should be recognized as such. I think that when we talk about confession of the analyst, it should be the realistic recognition of actual behavior that the patient signals to him, and that the patient is right, the analyst has to be honest, but no communication to the patient of anything beyond such acting out. And from that viewpoint, the communication of the countertransference is another problematic generalization of honesty of the analyst, by which of course, countertransference is acting out in that the patient, the analyst tells the patient how he feels in an unanalyzed way and creates a new reality. What co-construction at the bottom always involves acting out of the analyst, although it is unavoidable to a certain degree.
May I just respond very briefly? I mean, I have somewhat of the same reaction to what you're saying right now as I did when you were speaking about mature love. As you were speaking about mature love, I was saying, yes, that all sounds right. Yes, yes, it does, absolutely. And I thought, God, how do I get there? And sort of similarly, when you're talking about, sort of distinguishing between enactment and acting out, somehow you seem to make the assumption that the analyst is really in a position to make those distinctions, right? I mean, it seems to me more often than not that after the fact, sometimes I can see that I was, quotes, acting out. But there's a question of to the extent to which I can ever be sort of fully disembedded from some kind of ongoing sort of relational scenario which is being played out, really is the question, or the issue.
Yeah, well, one has to differentiate, it seems to me. Well, you raised two issues. First of all, how does one get there? As I mentioned initially, I was constructing a frame of what was missing on the basis of clinical material that I couldn't present. And the analysis how one get where is extremely complex and complicated. So I think the question is nice, but it's a little rhetorical. Yes, yeah. Regarding the serious issue that you raised. One has to differentiate, it seems to me, acute from chronic countertransference development. Countertransference develops at all points. It's an ongoing development in parallel to the transference. But with the relatively classical patients in analysis, neurotic level of organization, it is relatively moderate, it is relatively fast, it shifts with the content of reassociations throughout the session. So one has the possibility of an ongoing analysis of shifting emotional reactions and associations to the patient's material, and that can usually dealt with in the way I mentioned. On the other hand, there are chronic countertransference developments in which which happens usually with more severe patients who are under conditions under severe regression, and is characterized by an emotional shift in the relation to the patient that does not shift from moment to moment, but one gets stuck in a certain attitude to the patient. And that brings about a subtle change in the relation to that particular patient over a period of time, days, weeks, in contrast to the relation to all other patients. And that requires analysis outside the sessions. And while it is going on, it influences the analysis, no doubt about it. But at the point when the analyst can resolve it by analysis, self-analysis outside the sessions, it cannot be done inside the session. This happens with the severe psychopathology very frequently. At that point, the analyst acquires an understanding of an entire development over a period of time and may now return to a position of technical neutrality by analyzing what has happened, including his own participation in some ways that meant an acting out of the countertransference. So that under such circumstances, there occurs a co-construction unnoticed, except that the analyst may have a vague feeling, I'm not responding to this patient, I'm not my usual self, something is going on with me. Once he has resolved it, he can understand what it brings about, he can analyze that, including pointing out how something that is now understood about the patient and couldn't be understood before has influenced his intervention throughout this time. That would be part of the honesty, but again, I consider that as a complication that occurs mostly with severely ill patients and in the psycholytic psychotherapy with borderline patients.
Just a last comment that Harold's going to make.
A pre-lunch comment. The most famous acting out or enactment, because they shade into each other in the literature, is probably Freud's feeding the rat man. Now, he gave the rat man herring, incidentally. The reaction of the rat man was very interesting and important to understand in terms of the dyadic reactions going on between the two of them. First, the rat man thought, well, do I owe Freud money for the meal? And then he thought, or does he owe money to me for wasting time? Now, this extraordinary enactment in the early literature, and I urge you all to reread The Rat Man because it's fascinating and ever rewarding. But the point I wish to make in closing it before lunch, before our own feeding, is that the objectivity of the analyst was not nevertheless lost. That Freud was able to give us the essential dynamics and the pathogenesis of obsessive-compulsive neurosis. Not that it hasn't been added to, but the core of our understanding of obsessive-compulsive neurosis derives from the rat man case. And this brings me back to another current problem, the idea of giving up neutrality and objectivity. It's very important, and I think, Otto, and you were also emphasizing, it's very important to be able to come back from the enactment to be able to scrutinize ourselves, analyze ourselves and the dyadic relationship, and understand what has gone on. Freud did not lose perspective entirely, and as you can see, he gave us, in the rat man case, a tremendous amount of food for thought.
Thank you very much. We'll meet back here at 1:45, even though it said 1:30.